Welcome, everyone. I'm Lise Colyer, and this is a session on the role of labeling in driving positive change on farms. I'm so delighted to be joined this morning with Martin, Tim, Anya, Anya, and Fidelity. Just as a quick introduction to myself, I co-created a news and events website for food systems professionals called Quota Media. And in that role, I found myself hearing the same complaint from a highly disparate range of interviewees: retailers, bankers, farmers, including Fidelity Weston, who's with us today, food manufacturers, humanitarians, and campaigners. And they were all telling me that food labeling had to be improved so that consumers could apply their spending power to fixing the food system. The food system's problems are not news to anybody here. We all know that they include the fact that 30% of greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture and food production. 70% of drinking water is drawn for agriculture and food production. Up to 75% of crop diversity has already been lost. 1/3 of the Earth's soil is no longer productive, and I could go on. Also, hunger and malnutrition remain the biggest killer in the world, causing 30,000 deaths a day. Professor Tim Lang, who joins our panel today, has very strong views on the relationship between poor consumer labeling and the UK's soaring obesity levels. So, cutting a long story short, we brought a range of those people together to create a new non-profit called OmniAction, which is going to harmonize the conflicting metrics that exist to make unified labeling possible. So we'll end up with labels that make sense to everyone, everywhere, in other words. So the subject of this panel is something that I'm very passionate about, and I was delighted when Colyer asked me to chair. So now on to CLEAR. CLEAR stands for the Consortium for Labeling for the Environment, Animal Welfare and Regenerative, I always stumble over that, regenerative farming. CLEAR was launched in June last year. It's a coalition of 40 groups that include Sustain, the Food Ethics Council, the Sustainable Soils Alliance, Soil Association, RSPB, and Food, Farming and Countryside Commission. There's also the Sustainable Restaurants Association, Compassion in World Farming, and Friends of the Earth, along with, of course, many, many more, including the Nature Friendly Farming Network, and their chair, Martin Lise, is on our panel today. CLEAR is campaigning for mandatory labelling in the UK that provides honesty and transparency to consumers when it comes to terms such as grass-fed, outdoor bred, free range, local, and seasonal. These terms are currently pretty meaningless. And that's depressing because farmers producing a high quality product have no way of making all the benefits of that superior product known to consumers. You can find intensively farmed meat marketed as sustainable because the life cycle assessment used to determine this didn't take into account soil health, carbon sequestration, animal welfare, and other important factors. One universal benchmark label based on what is actually happening on farm and during processing should be used to label food at all points of purchase. This saves the supermarkets a great deal of time and money in trying to make the case for their items. In the case of Martin's insecticide-free crops, for example, which nurture biodiversity and protect soil health, customers would like to feel connected to the wildlife his farming supports. And supermarkets would like to align their brand values with this approach. Or in the case of Fidelity, meat can be labeled pasture-fed if it's only 51% pasture-fed. The nutritional value of her 100% pasture-fed meat is far greater when it comes to omega-3 fatty acids. And that's what her customers are attracted to, along with better animal welfare and better biodiversity. But current labeling guidelines don't express this. The hundreds of competing, conflicting, confusing labeling schemes we currently have are not helping anyone, not consumers, retailers, producers, or processors. In a world of disunity, businesses, farmers, and consumers are absolutely unified on this. And I've spoken to hundreds of people from across the food system about it. Absolutely nobody says that they benefit from going alone on labelling. Colyer is not looking to replace any existing schemes, many of which are actually run by their own members, such as the Soil Association and RSPB. And Colyer is not looking to reinvent the wheel with Defra by rendering existing data points meaningless. So that if you're already involved in sustainable farming incentives or any environmental land management scheme, you are already earning points toward a high rating according to the Colyer label. What Colyer wants to do is combine all existing data capture schemes into one government-backed, mandatory, harmonized scheme. This delivers consumers their rights to know exactly what they are putting in their bodies, how it affected the environment and animal welfare, and whether people were paid fairly. They want to know what their hard-earned money is supporting. The Sustainable Restaurant Association wants to include this level of detail on menus. It's not just a retail question. The data capture is not a static framework as Colyer see it. It's a set of standards that continually evolve. The point is to just get started with what we already know. As Anya Doherty would say, who joins our panel today, we can't keep kicking the can down the road. There is a real urgency to this. The climate emergency is one reason for the urgency, and new trade deals are another. UK consumers want food standards protected and enhanced in the face of so much change. And we have Defra policy advisor Hannah Jordan with us today, who is tracking the emerging pressures to help farmers express the sustainability of their products to consumers, integrating data capture across labelling and Defra requirements. I'm going to throw to Fidelity, who I know would like to see more visionary leadership from our politicians, akin to, say, the White House, where Joe Biden has decided to tackle market concentration of meat packers so that farmers can get a better price for their product and consumers pay less for it. I think Fidelity feels that Defra's aspirations under their 25-year environment plan are being held back without transparent mandatory labelling. Oops. Oh, something's just happened. There we go. I think she feels that what's needed is a really high level of political leadership on what is essentially a citizenship issue. This could be transformational in society's engagement with food and farming. So as I said, I'm going to ask Fidelity to chime in as she sees fit. And please, to our audience, take this as a cue as well. We'll have plenty of time for questions. Please put questions to our panelists in the Q&A section, not the chat. I know you're going to be reminded of that persistently. And although I know we have brilliant volunteers keeping an eye out to make sure that great questions don't get lost or unanswered and good points all get made, I will rely on everybody on our panel to keep an eye out for great questions that we need to make sure we turn our attention to. So now, without any further ado, let's hear from our panel of experts themselves. I'm going to start with Hannah Jordan, who is a key Defra policy advisor, and she's going to pick up on the elements of labelling that Defra is aware of. And I know I need to stop sharing first. There we go.
Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Brilliant, better, second time lucky. So thanks ever so much for having me along to speak to you all today. It's always a slightly daunting prospect coming on as a representative of the government, because there are things we can say and things that we can't say, but I'm really passionate personally about labelling. So I was really excited to be able to come along and talk to you all today. I'm a vet by background, but I've worked in the civil service now for the last 5 years and currently in a role as a strategic policy advisor to the Secretary of State at Defra. Thought I'd start with the exciting title of Could Labelling Drive Positive Change on Farm, by talking a little bit about the context that Defra are operating in, because sometimes it looks very simple from the outside, but when we are operating on the inside, it just isn't that simple for us. So there are an awful lot of demands on labelling. Tim will probably talk about that later on as well, but there's a list here that I won't run through. There's some that people aren't always aware of. So there are new schemes coming onto the market for things like extended producer responsibility for packaging and a deposit return scheme for drinks bottles, which have labelling requirements. The environment, as Lise mentioned not 5 minutes ago, is a bucket term, and it covers all sorts of things: soil, water, air, carbon, nature, biodiversity. There's an awful lot of demands there. We had the very recent allergen labelling changes, animal welfare, lots and lots of demands on it. People would always like to use labelling for many things. Labelling isn't the only lever available to government. I'm probably teaching you all to suck eggs, but there are other options available to us. So there might be fiscal interventions or other regulatory interventions. Lise mentioned data and metrics and sort of frameworks to help standardise things behind a label, potentially. And there's also things like due diligence. There's a recent piece of work we've done on due diligence around rainforest deforestation, things like that, and reporting, mandatory reporting of things like food waste. Food labelling policy is devolved. So a cohesive approach, ideally, would be nice across all the devolved administrations. Not always as simple as it sounds, but we do work very hard with our devolved partners to make sure that we've got something that's cohesive wherever possible. There's lots of government departments with an interest. We work collaboratively with them. The main ones up here: Department of Health and Social Care, BEIS, Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, a little bit of Department for International Trade. They all have an interest. The main one's probably Department of Health, particularly on the obesity, health and nutrition side. And then last but not least, there are existing regulations. The main one is you must not mislead. And then a whole sector of assurance schemes, other labels, chaos, I think is my preferred term for describing it. But there are favourites out there. So we've got Red Tractor, we've got RSPCA Assured, Soil Association, LEAF, lots of familiar labels and assurance schemes that are already operating that we need to think about. So moving on, could we drive change on farm? It's a really exciting area, labelling, and we certainly want to explore the potential. The first question that comes up is, can we harness the consumer? It comes up every time we talk about labelling, consumer, 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 and it's natural to go there first. But yes and no, I think is probably where we are at the moment. I should caveat everything I say here with that we've started from an animal welfare perspective. So a lot of what I'm saying here is me talking from an animal welfare perspective, but this is more broadly applicable than animal welfare. So yes and no, consumers consistently say they care about welfare and the environment, but this doesn't translate through every time to their purchasing decisions. This is often known as the value action gap. So other factors come into play and trade-offs are involved when consumers are picking things in store. So that's in the UK, quite often price or quality or pack size comes up before they come to things like welfare. Some consumers are actively interested, like me. Some are passive, so they're interested, but they're not actually really altering their shopping habits. Some are not interested at all and possibly never will be. And some are unable to change for other reasons. And data on these subsets varies depending on who's done the latest survey, but some pre-pandemic figures I was given estimated that there were 3 to 4 million active consumers, around 8, maybe 9 million passive consumers, and the remainder buying on price, either because they're not interested or they can't do anything but buy on price. All of that said, in July last year, David Halpin, who is the chief executive of the Nudge Unit, was talking up providing clearer guidance to consumers. He was focusing on an environmental angle here, but he was really positive about the option or the opportunity for consumers to make choices based on environmental or other credentials. And in that sense, he was talking about creating a genuine ranking between supermarkets that created competition. And in his view, if we were able to do that, we'd only need to move maybe 5%, even as low as 2% of consumers to start to get the supermarkets to act and to compete with each other, which could bring about huge change. So it's not to say that all is lost. And last but not least, on point one of harnessing the consumer, everything I've just said is focused very much on retail and supermarkets, but there's the huge out-of-home sector as well, which Lise touched on very briefly, things about, whether it's something on the menu or whether it's something that's a declaration per business. McDonald's and their free-range eggs comes to mind. So there are things that can be done out of retail stores as well. The second one gets me really excited because we've got all of our future farming schemes in development, better connecting the farmer and producer to the consumer. I'm hoping that Martin will elaborate on this when he comes on in a moment. But farmers at the moment that are opting for higher welfare systems or delivering environmental benefits don't always receive a premium or a reward for these products. In fact, it's very difficult sometimes for them to identify those to the consumer at all. And we're really interested in whether labelling we'd like to establish whether labelling could be used to better support UK farmers and producers that are taking forward these innovative ideas or supporting the environment or supporting welfare. including through things like the sustainable farming incentive, whereas at the moment, there's no easy way for them to do that. There could also be other elements here as well, so stricter regulation of terminology used on labelling around things like grass-fed, which Lise has already touched on, could have a role here. So it's really clear what grass-fed actually means. The third point, the potential to enable clear, consistent demand. So it's arguable there's a market failure. At the moment, you couldn't create clear, consistent demand if you tried, because you don't know what you're demanding for. Mandatory egg labelling is actually a good example where there has been a creation of clear, consistent demand, and I'll move on to talk about that in a moment. And then last but not least, and I think this is the biggest point beyond the consumer, it's influencing wider industry behaviour. So the value action gap I talked about earlier could be reduced by creating a food environment that makes it easier for consumers to choose products that match their values. And this might incentivise retailers to then increase the availability of those, or the affordability of those, or the accessibility of those products. And that's the change that I would really like to see. So I talked about mandatory egg labelling, and it's a good example of creating clear, consistent demand, certainly in the UK. Mandatory labelling was a crucial factor for the increased sale of high welfare eggs, although clearly other factors were important in the process. The chart that you can see here is from 1996 to 2020, and it shows egg throughput by system. You can see, I won't read all the definitions out to you, but I'll let you look at it and absorb it. You can see the changes that have happened over that period. So in 2008, the EU egg regulation on egg production for method of production labelling came in, and it's been really successful. So 62% of eggs sold today are free range, compared with 32% in 2004. And as a consequence, people don't always realise this, the price of free range eggs has dropped. So they were very expensive, they were marked up more, but now they're averaging 15p per medium free range egg. As they've become more mainstream, the price has come down. That's really encouraging. The UK egg market has grown each year, and with free range has been contributing 25% to total growth. We've had very limited low welfare eggs coming into the UK, no to very limited at all. And this was due to three main factors. The first is simplicity of the grading system. So consumers understand the linear progression from battery to barn to free range to organic. It's simple, it's clear, it's pretty easy to understand. Because it's mandatory, you have to label that it's a battery or caged egg. We don't have battery cages anymore, obviously we've got enriched cages, but it has to be on there, it has to say it's caged. There's no avoiding it, you have to make an active choice to buy those. And thirdly, supermarkets didn't actually want to be seen to be promoting or selling caged eggs anymore. So you'll see on the chart in front of you, there were campaigns by celebrity chefs, some of the big retailers moved. Nobody wanted to be seen as the one falling behind. So they responded by increasing the availability, the accessibility, and the affordability of free range eggs, which made it much easier for consumers to buy them if they wanted to. They were at eye level, and they either stopped selling shell eggs from cages, or prices dropped. So it just became much easier for consumers to make those choices. Moving on again, we're not operating in a vacuum. So food information is not, and labelling is not static. Again, I'm sure Tim might talk about this when he comes on, but there's an awful lot for government to keep track of and to think about when we're thinking about labelling. Other countries are moving quite quickly on welfare labelling, thinking about what they might do, whether it's voluntary or mandatory. The EU is a good example of this. Businesses are understandably pressing ahead with eco-labels and carbon footprinting, as I'm sure Anya will point to in her talk. There's work underway on better metrics for sustainability, for example, the global farm metric, and this could be linked to labelling. Changes in farm subsidies is a really good example. It's going to potentially change how farm businesses operate, how they wish to connect with their consumers. Might be a role for labelling to be able to connect those up. What about imports, that huge elephant in the room? Will labelling apply to them? Switzerland do apply mandatory labelling to some of their imported products. There's potential there for us to investigate that. And then to be able to compare and contrast your farm carbon footprint, whether that's on a label or not, you need a consistent auditing method. And that will be another, another question that might need to be answered before we get to putting that on a label. Lots and lots of questions, and unfortunately not always many answers. So where are we actually in Defra at the moment? We're reviewing where we are, the classic government line. We are developing a food white paper that will respond to Henry Dimbleby's independent review that many of you may have seen, the National Food Strategy Independent Review. And we're working with Departments of Health, Education and Bays and others on that, so across Whitehall, to make sure that we've got a joined up approach. Hopefully it'll be a once in a generation opportunity to create a food system that feeds our nation and sort of prepares it a bit better for tomorrow. Quite exciting. And last but not least, a lot of you will have contributed to our call for evidence on food labelling for animal welfare, which is now closed. We ran that with Wales, Northern Ireland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And we do get asked quite a lot, why was it focused on animal welfare? And have we forgotten about the bigger picture? And there's an awful lot going on in labelling. And just to reassure you, we haven't forgotten about the bigger picture, but we do have to start somewhere. So during the passage of the Agriculture Bill, we made a commitment to examine what can be done through labelling to promote high standards and high animal welfare. And animal welfare labelling is reasonably well established. So it has domestic examples, overseas examples, quite a good evidence base. We had to start somewhere, so we thought we'd start there. We have included in it questions about eco-labelling where we can, and try to make sure that what we're asking is about filling evidence gaps, so we're not closing off any doors. And certainly an interesting question from my perspective is about whether there are changes that we could make to labelling that could start somewhere, whether it's welfare or elsewhere, and whether they could be built upon and expanded to include environment or other metrics as we get those more robust. A little bit more detail on the welfare labelling call for evidence for anyone that hasn't been through it and responded. I won't read this slide out to you, I'll just leave you to look through the headings there. But essentially we were aiming to address evidence gaps on the impacts, costs and deliverability of different types of labelling reform, because there wasn't much that we had ahead of this call for evidence. And we are now going through and analysing all the responses. So in terms of our next steps, as I said, analysing all the responses, it closed on the 6th of December after running for 12 weeks, and we had about 1,600 in total from a range of different respondents. Any of the responses used will inform things like the government's food white paper, food strategy, to make sure that we're bringing in all the evidence that we've got for that. And any future proposals, whether on welfare labelling or wider labelling, will be developed in tandem, hopefully under the banner of the food strategy. And just to add, if you did respond to that call for evidence, we are really, really grateful to those of you that took the time and otherwise engaged with us. So we look forward to more close collaboration with you on welfare labelling and other labelling as we continue to explore options in this area. Thanks ever so much.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Hannah. I know that many in our audience will have some follow-up questions, so do please put those in the Q&A. I can see some questions coming through already. Martin, I'm sure you will have some questions of your own in response to Hannah's brilliant presentation. Martin Lines is the chair of the Nature Friendly Farming Network. Martin will be well known to many in our audience. He's a third-generation arable farmer in Cambridgeshire. And Martin's going to tell us more about the vital role of mandatory labelling to improve standards in farming. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity and joining this morning. I do think there's a fundamental, huge opportunity in driving that positive change if we get this right, and it's going to be a journey, as we're hearing from Hannah, where we've got to have a starting point and build on that and have that clear building steps. So for my own farm, we've gone from that industrialised arable system over the last 20 years about delivering habitat and moved and along the journey of a regenerative farming system where we're reintroducing livestock that we lost many years ago to build fertility, soil health. We're delivering habitats right across my farm landscape. But I regularly get contacted by local people and people on social media. How can they purchase for the produce I'm producing? How can they connect with what I'm trying to do on my landscape? I get those same requests coming into the Nature Friendly Farming Network right across the UK and actually abroad. They recognise many farmers are doing great things and they actually want to know how they can support them. Which shops can they go to? Which supermarkets? Which farm shops? How do they recognise that when they stand at a supermarket shelf of the different products they've got on the different labels? The consumer is so confused at the moment, and there's so much greenwashing going on, and a huge amount more to come. We actually know food labelling can really deliver positive change, and we've seen that in various labelling systems. And it gives the farmer recognition of the produce they're doing. It gives them marketing opportunity, and it builds trust and associations with our consumers. And they are the ones we really need to reconnect to their food choices, regardless of what they want to eat. They need to understand how it's produced, where it's produced, what ingredients it has, what effects is it having on our landscape? Is it positive? Is it negative for biodiversity, for carbon, for rural economies? There's some really key things we could build into to that. I will pick up on the point that around what I deliver on my farm is not a subsidy. I haven't received a subsidy for many, many years. I've received an area-based payment for some actions, and I receive payments for public outcomes of biodiversity and bits. And that's where we're hopefully moving to. And for me, the recognition of the SFI is a bit of a broad and shallow delivery. The recognition really should be around that local nature recovery, where farmers are really valued for their connectivity of landscape recovery, biodiversity, carbon recovery, and step up the ambition of delivery. So we really are empowering farmers and consumers to make action happen on the ground. A recent nature-friendly farming survey on our Rethink Farming campaign we launched last year, we surveyed the farmers and the members of the public. 93% of the farmers who responded think food labels should be clearly identified methods of production. 60% of the public actually go looking for methods of production. They don't always make the choices, but are interested in how and where it's produced. 97% of the public want UK labels to be clearer on the production so they can make those positive choices. They may not be able to afford the premium brand, but they may be able to step up a purchasing choice for maybe a few pence or just a different system of production, so they can be engaged to deliver. 99% of the public wants to support farmers restoring nature and climate. They recognise the biodiversity and climate crisis we're in and recognise farmers can deliver that change. But we need clear, transparent, mandatory labelling systems to allow that to happen. I'm old enough, unfortunately, to remember the old kite system we had many, many years ago, that the consumer trusted the kite. They understood that the produce that had that on was a standard. And that it was connected with imported products as well. We had a standard of delivery for all goods and for our food. We know there's many, we've had the free range egg example. So we know by having a mandatory labelling system drove positive change. It reduced the marketplace for the cage system that the consumer recognised wasn't the best animal welfare and moved purchasing choice. But that also allows us as farmers and the supply chain, and the public to put pressure on supply chains to step up their game. And they move their stocking shelf, as we heard from the example. And if we can drive that through mandatory labelling systems, that we can connect to the consumer and empower them and connect with our supply chains to make sure that that is delivered at a fair level. We know there's many other labels already out there. The organic, fair trade, fair to nature, all have clear benefits, all have clear levels of delivery that a farmer can step up to and deliver. So for myself, delivering higher biodiversity at more than 10% across my farm landscape. For 8 or 9 years now, we haven't used insecticides because I've understood the biodiversity I need to have on the farm and the connectivity of my productivity of working with nature. But how do we find a labelling system? And we can do that through one or two that are there. But we need to communicate the differences we produce and connect that with the public. We know a lot of languages around regenerative farming and regen food. We're seeing a lot of the big corporate markets circling that opportunity and to brand their produce around regen or regenerative or nature-based or all this language. But unless we have some clearly defined matrix around it, it will just be greenwash. It will not deliver the positive change we need and at pace. And if we have those standards, we can actually connect farmers to deliver and give the market return for doing it. We know many of the supermarkets have in the past, and unfortunately still currently, have fake farm names. They know the consumer trusts the farmer, so they create Willow Farm or whatever brand name it will be, but that food product comes in from the UK and abroad and under the same labelling system. And it's complete greenwash. You've connected the trust from the consumer to a farm branded name that delivers no output, no positive change on the ground. So how, we heard from Hannah that definitely, there already is legislation, but it's not being enforced hard enough. It's being sideswiped round and just gently massaged, but not actually delivered the positive change. If you go into any supermarket currently, you'll see many products having a Union Jack flag on them, and some would have a red tractor mark, but the supply chain is recognised the Union Jack as a consumer engagement point. And in my local supermarket, I can go and buy sugar with a great big Union Jack on, packed in the UK. Coming in, imported cane sugar and other products from other places, produced at different standards, using ingredients and pesticides that's illegal to use in the UK, and having a biodiversity and a climate impact somewhere else. But because we have a Union Jack on it, the consumer thinks it is good. We need to make sure that they clearly understand that labelling system and the empowerment that can give to our consumers. And we have all that different food coming in different standards. We're going to be looking at having carbon and biodiversity markets possibly coming in the future, and border tariffs attached to that. As we know, the EU are already looking at markets. The UK and the government are looking at opportunities in the few years to come. So how do we distinguish what is the positive effect of our food choices? We know our food globally, our food choices having a massive detrimental effect to our environment and to biodiversity. So we need to reconnect that and empower it through some labelling systems that can be standardised and can be levelled out across the UK, but across on a globalised system. Because actually, I'm not against trade. I want to trade with worldwide farmers on a similar level playing field, that we have a similar effect to our environment and to biodiversity and to climate. But what we have been struggled with, the UK has an ambition to deliver higher environmental improvements, biodiversity, air quality, water quality, animal welfare. But as we may see, is trade coming in at a different standard that will just kick the stool from underneath us. But we can and we must champion what we can do as UK producers and demonstrate that to our consumers. We know that that different standard is going to happen, and we're going to have a different ability as UK producers competing on a global scale. As a UK farmer, my cost of production will never match, as an arable farmer, match a globalized commodity market. But what I can do is demonstrate how and why I farm the way we do, improving carbon, biodiversity, food quality and quantity, and connect that with the consumer and engage the consumer then in what we're doing. And actually, I think that's where we have a real positive opportunity in the future if we had some mandatory labelling system, methods of production, environmental and carbon footprinting on there, that actually we can trade globally and be proud of what we produce and actually demonstrate that meat product, that grain product, or the manufactured protein, whatever we produce, that the consumer can understand it, but we can import it and export it on a level playing field. We know our global environment is in a free fall. We're going to have weather events in the UK that will stop us being able to produce food on some years. We'll have devastating floods or heat. We will need to import, but we want to import from positive places. And the reverse will happen. We will be exporting some products in the future, but we want to do that on a positive thing. So I really hope and look forward to Defra really engaging and being able to look at a fair and rapid transition to deliver a mandatory labelling system that we can all get behind as producers, farmers, supply chain, and our consumers, and actually move it not just in our supermarkets, but in the retail and in the restaurants. And if you're eating a kebab on the local street on a Saturday night, that you can understand the choices you have because it's clearly labelled in front of us. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the questions later.
Thanks so much. Thanks a lot, Martin. It was really interesting to hear you talking about weather events as well, because I know that Tim Lang, who's going to be speaking to us soon, has actually been studying Defra's report on UK food security, which did look at this. It came out last month, I think the 22nd of December, and it's certainly on everybody's mind. And I think you're quite right to raise the fact that, you know, using labeling to encourage a positive preparation for these events is incredibly important, and certainly something that's not getting talked about a lot at the moment, but certainly, you know, needs a lot more attention. We're going to move next to Anya Doherty, who's the CEO of Food Steps. Anya's going to explain to us the real world demand from food companies to label their products with a carbon footprint and other sustainability information. The interesting thing about where Anya comes from, and Anya, you can correct me on this, is that it's driven from the consumer end, from the food business end. And I know that Anya actually struggles with getting better on-farm data, but I'm going to hand over to you and let you explain that to us a lot better.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And yeah, thanks Hannah and Martin for very interesting talks so far. Let me know if you can see that.
Yes, we can. Yes.
Yeah, really great to be here, and thanks so much for having me. So yeah, I'm Anya Doherty. I'm founder and CEO of Food Steps, and we work with food businesses to help them measure, reduce, and communicate their environmental impacts. And today, just in these 10 minutes, I'll be speaking a bit about the technology and the methods and data that we have to do this, as well as how we can actually use that to inform better consumer choices. So a little bit of background to Food Steps and what we do. As I said, we work with food businesses really on measuring, reducing, and communicating environmental impacts. We focus mostly on carbon at the moment, but there's a huge scope of other environmental impacts like land use, biodiversity, soil, etc. to come. There are three parts of our work. So we've built a platform that helps food companies to calculate and reduce their environmental impacts, so they can put in information about their food and get those scores back. This rests on our database and methodology, which we've been working on for the last 3 or 4 years. And I'll talk a bit more about how we can harmonise that and try to scale that up across the industry. And then obviously bringing this all back to the consumer side is what do we do with that data once it's there. And we've been working on consumer-facing labelling and different types of engagement to actually communicate that environmental impact. And I'll talk a bit more about how those labels have landed in the industry. And we've also been working on an app called Food Story, which really recognises that it can actually be quite hard to put all of the information that you want on a single label that people can understand. So we've built a QR code app, which is quite narrative based and really speaks a little bit more to the journey that the food has been on from farm to fork, and giving people that option to have more information if they are among those active consumers. So just a quick bit about where this all came from, which will hopefully give context to what I'll be speaking about. So we did our first project with the University of Cambridge, who wanted to look at the carbon footprint and land use of over 3,500 different food items that they purchased. You can imagine the kind of challenges from data and methods when you go into a system like that, trying to measure something that hasn't been measured before. So it was quite a long project. It took several months, but the university then published their new sustainable food policy and a sustainable food journey, which showed they'd reduced the carbon footprint of their food by 33%. And we also worked with the university to trial carbon labels, which did show a reduction in the carbon footprint of food purchased. We then tried to work to build on this and scale up the work that we started with Cambridge. So we got a grant from Innovate UK to build the Food Steps platform. And for the last 2 years, we've been working with over 50 industry clients on actually rolling out this environmental monitoring and labelling. And our aim going forward is very much to contribute to the national effort to reduce the environmental impacts of food, and working very much in a B2B way with the food industry. So I've got 4 questions which I'd like to go through today, which focus on technology and consumer choices. The first is really, as Lise said, looking at what the actual demand for measuring the environmental impacts of food is, and who that is coming from. The second question is, assuming that demand is there, is the technology and the methods that we have, are they actually good enough to meet that demand? The third question is, what are the best routes for actually collecting data across complex food supply chains? So sort of building on question 2. And then the last thing I'd like to go through is how we can actually use this technology and data to drive better practices via farm within the industry and with consumers. And obviously, just to put this in the kind of wider context, which I think Lise very aptly started off the talk with, is that food really is still one of the leading drivers of the climate and ecological crisis. So there is a sense of urgency to all of these questions. So firstly, just looking at what the demand is for measuring the environmental impacts of food. On a personal level, I've seen this grow exponentially since I first started doing this work about 4 years ago. In an anecdotal way, I remember really the first few companies that I started speaking to, they would say things like, well, why should we care about climate change? What's the point in doing this? And I'm pleased to say that I nearly never have conversations like that anymore. It's very much few companies getting in touch with people like us to say, we know that we need to do this and we want to do this. How can we make it happen? So I think the landscape has changed dramatically in a short period of time. And we recognise really 3 pull factors and 3 push factors which are driving this. On the pull factor side, there really is that consumer demand for more sustainable products. So lots of consumers across many surveys do say that they want brands to help them be more sustainable, and we can see a few companies responding to that change in demand. The second thing is that lots of companies want to align with sustainability to attract great employees and keep them, and particularly at the moment with staff shortages across the hospitality industry, we do see sustainability as something which companies really want to be driving home to get more loyal employees. And then finally, there are a small but growing number of the company leaders who do see sustainability as a personal legacy and something which they're trying to implement in their company. But push factors are also important, and we have seen these really make a difference, in my opinion. So firstly, delivering on net zero commitments with COP, lots of companies put forward emission reduction targets by 2030, and actually staying good and true to those is something which is definitely pushing people forward. Increasingly, we're seeing that there's also requirements within buyer contracts and within the retail space to have product footprints, and several companies will come to us and say they actually need to have this in order to fulfill their buying contracts. And then thirdly, I think there is really kind of in amongst all the uncertainty about where the legislation is heading is this kind of threat that it might go quite far and that people will need to have this information ready. And I do think that that is pushing companies to try and get ahead of the curve early. But regardless, I think that there is demand from lots of different food companies within the industry, and on the right are just a selection of some of those that we've been working with in the last 2 years. You can see it's kind of ranges from companies which you might recognise as household names down to very small artisan producers. And in just 2 years, we've also started working in 6 countries around the world. So it is a global piece on the demand. But on to the second question. So assuming that demand is all kind of good and ready to go, is the technology that we have now actually good enough to measure the environmental impacts of food and do that accurately and scalably? This looks a bit detailed, but I'll walk you all through it. There are really 3 approaches that we've seen being used in the industry, and we do work with all 3 of these ourselves. So the first, if I just go to enhanced secondary data sets, this is really probably the most widely used approach in the industry. So this is compiling secondary data sources on the environmental impacts of food. So it might be academic studies, it might be studies which have already been published in the industry, and trying to use those to match most accurately to existing food products that are out there. And really, it's quite a straightforward process. Mostly people just ask maybe about the ingredient origins, but really for most of the food life cycle from farm to fork, you are relying on secondary data. The sort of hybrid approach, which is in the middle, is where you're mixing secondary data with some primary data. So in most cases, this will still be using a lot of academic literature or published studies, but you might ask the food companies, suppliers and producers about some quite top level information, for example, what farming methods are being used, what the yield is, what the processing and packaging material types are. And then on the third sort of more detailed end of the spectrum is where you're actually going specifically to every life cycle stage within the food, and you're asking detailed questionnaires, potentially doing monitoring, etc. And yeah, to what Hannah and Martin were saying, there is a lot to be done on harmonizing these approaches and making sure that they are consistent across the industry. But hopefully it's kind of, yeah, interesting just to see the sort of scale of different levels of detail that companies are working with at the moment. Probably the more interesting question is which of these is actually good or good enough. And yeah, we sort of see 5 factors that we sort of look into whether they're good enough. The first is, can the method actually differentiate between food item types? So this would be, can you differentiate between the environmental impact of a tomato and a carrot, say? And all 3 of those methods can do that to varying degrees of certainty. Can you differentiate between the same food types that are coming from different supply systems? And the sort of short answer is that generally, if you're only using secondary data, you can't really differentiate between 2 tomatoes if they're coming from different systems, whereas if you're using more primary data, you can. A very kind of pertinent question in the industry is it affordable and is it practical? And this is where you get slightly different responses across the 3. So obviously the one which uses most secondary data is the cheapest and easiest to implement, but you're missing out on some of that accuracy. Is it repeatable and consistent across the industry? I think this is where there's probably the biggest gains to be made in all 3 of these methods, because there's sort of a lack of a generally agreed framework for how to do the work. But for me personally, the 3 ticks at the bottom are probably the most important. Is it better than what we currently have? Yes to all 3. So even if you are using secondary data and you might be missing out on things like consistency or differentiating between foods in some supply chains, it is still better, in my opinion, to start from something and then work your way up to things which are more advanced and more detailed, rather than just ignoring the problem kind of altogether at the moment. This is again a little bit of detail, but I'll walk you all through it. So this is sort of which routes to collecting primary data are available across supply chains and which ones work best. So this is assuming that you want to actually collect data from producers and from suppliers and bring that into a consistent label. And we've been looking at 3 different approaches. The first is the top-down approach, where you're actually getting the mandate from the food company. So that might be a retailer, it might be a restaurant. And what they're doing is actually going to their suppliers and then to their producers and asking for that data. What's really good about that approach is that you can get very consistent data that's returned. You really have one kind of person who's asking for that information. And you can quite easily target the most high value data, so you don't necessarily need to ask for every single data point across the whole system. The sort of downside is that you require incentives, so it does require, for example, the retailer or the restaurant actually paying for that work, and they really need to be really sort of bought in and pushing for that. And I think we're not quite there yet in terms of really showing that all companies across the industry are willing to pay for that. The second approach is an aggregator approach. So this is where you might use existing systems within a food supply chain to try and bring that data together. And this might be, for example, farm industry bodies or a kind of farm app gathering data from lots of farmers. And then you might have a logistics software which is bringing that together for suppliers. The great thing about this is that it's really easy to reach a large number of data points, but the downside is that it's hard to actually control the data quality, and it can be hard to do assurance and verification in using this approach. And then finally, there's the bottom-up approach, which is sort of like a system-wide approach if everyone was agreeing on independent reporting approaches. What's great about this is that you have everyone in the whole industry doing the same thing. In our view, it's best suited to a government-led approach, so you really need to have that sort of system-wide framework, and excitingly, it can open up the possibility of doing system-wide data sharing. But yeah, I think with all of this, it's kind of a work in progress, and seeing which approaches will work best in the future. And then my final question was, how should we use this technology and data to actually drive better practices? So I think there are lots of different stakeholders that can benefit from having access to this data. And these are 3 examples that we've worked on ourselves. So on a farm level, when you actually do a farm level assessment, it's an amazing opportunity to share that data and that reports and the information with farmers. And this year we're looking to set up a learning forum between a number of farms of similar size, where we've already done a environmental impact assessment. And just as an example here, we looked at some farms in Shropshire and Cornwall, which were beef and lamb farms, and found that there was a 34% difference in the carbon footprint. And it's just based off of things like yield, manure management, and energy use on farm. And it opens up an amazing opportunity for those farmers to speak to each other and do knowledge sharing workshops. On the food company side, we think that it's really important for food companies to have an accessible way to look at the impact of thousands of their food products. And we're seeing lots of companies now using things like our dashboard to actually develop products that have a lower footprint. So when they have access to that information, it makes it a lot easier to make decisions on an environmental basis. And it also makes it easier to set targets and see the impact of changes to menus and suppliers, etc. And then also a very interesting line is, of course, the consumers. So working on engaging and clear labelling. We've seen from some of the work that we've been doing over the last year or so that it's not kind of a silver bullet, it's not going to solve the solution, but we're getting about a 5% switch just with having, for example, a poster or some labels on some food choices. So, for example, we put this one up in one of the cafes, and the client had a mandate to try and increase the amount of oat milk, and they wanted to make that switch. We saw a 5% change just having that poster up in the workplace. And similarly with the work that we did at Cambridge, we saw a 5% reduction in the carbon footprint. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity to start to share this information more widely across lots of different stakeholders in the chain. And so yeah, my personal conclusions from this are that I do think that the technology and methodology is ready to go. But most importantly, I think that it's ready to be improved on in real world situations. So the best way to improve technology and software, etc., is to actually go out and use it and find out how it can be improved. And so what we really need to stop doing is kind of dragging our feet, waiting for a perfect solution, and actually just get out there with what we have, and it will improve over time, both in affordability and in accuracy, etc. We do think that there is the demand to do that now. Lots of food companies and consumers are looking for this information. I do think that having top-down directives on creating a level playing field for things like methodology, etc., from the government or the industry will go a long way, because there's lots of different players at the moment trying to do this work, and it can be very difficult because there isn't really one consistent framework. And then, yeah, as I said, I really do think that scalability and price per item will only improve by doing this more and more. So it is better to get out there and start improving things right now. So that is it from me. Thanks very much for listening. I'm looking forward to hearing questions at the end.
Thanks so much, Anya. Just in addition to the point you made regarding impacts at around about 5%, so seeing people make the switch, I know that also simply having seeded the conversation, restaurateurs themselves just made different decisions about which options to make available and which ones to serve, so that actually the reduction in footprint was much greater than that in a practical context. So that's another example as to why just talking about this and making the information available can have, you know, even a bigger impact even than that which is being demonstrated on the ground. So thanks so much. We're turning lastly but never leastly to Professor Tim Lang, who's going to explain to us how better informed consumers are more able to tackle endemic crises such as obesity, as well as the climate crisis and challenges to animal welfare and food standards. Over to you, Professor Lang.
I'm laughing because you can't possibly do that, Lise. Not you, anyone. But thank you. Basically, I've not done slides because I thought if I'm going last, we won't want any more, because the others have said really rich thoughts that we need to discuss, and the chat is doing that. And I've been trying to answer some of the Q&As as well for my bit. I'm going to make 5 very simple points to try and help wrap it up. Look, there are hundreds of different approaches, as Anya was very elegantly saying. There are different methods, there are different pressure groups, there are different demands, there are different levels of severity of why we need to improve actions on food. And currently there's a mess. Let me just speak. I was the world's first professor of food policy. I have great gravitas, so you can't go against me, of course. I'm saying that provocatively, Lise. There is a mess. There is what in academic circles we call policy cacophony. You've got the Prime Minister at the moment of Britain, whose wife is an animal welfarist. Well, isn't it a great big surprise? Animal welfare has rocketed through. So Hannah has to be very neutral at this point. It's wonderful. We've got animal welfare. I spent my life supporting animal welfare stuff. So I'm totally in favor of it. But animal welfare over the environment, over health, over labor and fair trade issues, over social criteria, come on. I cannot believe the Oxford Real Farming Conference, my dear old friend, Colin Tudge, and his lovely, dear, also friend, Ruth West, set up this conference 10 years ago in order to try and say, we've got to get a grip of the British food system and stop just saying more of the same is what we need. So why now? Why do we need to be talking about the weakest of policy interventions, which is what labeling is, by the way? The evidence is not good for labeling. People don't use them. They're a waste of time unless you have a baby or have a heart attack. Then suddenly people get a bit interested and start reading 0.6 type somewhere buried in vast advertising on a plastic package. Is this the way forward for the whole of changing the British food system, as most of us at the Oxford Real Farming Conference really set out to do and still do? The answer is no. But it's actually still very useful, because right now, Britain has chosen to leave where it gets most of its food from that it doesn't grow. So if we can't now do it, I mean, Brexit was a complete joke. Secondly, all governments have failed to help consumers. Back in the Thatcher era, I'm that old, we argued that there should be pesticide labels. And I was firmly told, Defra didn't exist, Hannah, then, it was MAF, the Ministry of Agriculture, firmly told, we don't need to label this. If you're worried about these things, you can go and look for where there aren't any. So you've got to go and look for organic. I said, well, what's that about consumer sovereignty? What's that about information flows telling us what we need? And good market economics only work if there is information. That was the Thatcherite and indeed the Johnsonite theory of political economy. So it's a nonsense. But why now? The reality is we have opportunities. That's why. We have got Brexit. Britain has no excuse for not getting a grip of labelling. None. If nothing gets together, the august National Trust with us lot, this is it. We've got a food white paper. Hannah should be looking terribly tired at the moment, Hannah, because you should be worn to a complete frazzle and blood dripping from your hands for writing such intense versions of what this food bill is going to be to resolve all the problems that Henry Dimbleby raised. And people like me would like all the bits he didn't raise, and I speak as a fan of Henry Dimbleby. Nothing about labour, nothing about trade, wish-wash on lots of fronts, but actually lots of good stuff about junk food cycle and about information, etc., etc. We've got Scotland and Wales's food bills and so on. So there's a real danger of the UK being out of the loop unless we get a grip of simple things like labelling. The third point I've already said, but want to really stress, labelling is weak. So why are people like Lise and the OmniAction group, which I'm part of, trying to get multi-criteria labelling? Why are we wasting our time if it's so weak? The answer is we're not wasting our time because this is lowest common denominator time. It drives reformulation. even if people don't use the label, it embarrasses companies into saying, holy Moses, I didn't realize that's what was in my product. We did a study at our center at City University 15 years ago, a huge European study looking at different food products. On the simple one that we in Britain looked at, bread, we found people hadn't a clue what was in their bread. I don't mean consumers, I mean the manufacturers didn't know what was in their food. We didn't know what was actually in the wheat or in the ingredients or in the improvers. So unless we take seriously consumer sovereignty and that rhetoric, and I talk with Conservative MPs, Conservative members of the Lords, this is something everyone says they agree with. So we have an opportunity, dear folk, listening in, the 128 people on this call, we have an opportunity to work together around OmniAction. So please join in this. And the fourth point, very pompous, now I speak pompously as an academic, it's multi-criteria time or bust. It's not we need to know about ingredients or sourcing or the environment or health or the economic or the labor issues or the social criteria or the animal welfare or the other ethical issues. It's all of them that matter, actually. Sustainability is about all of that. And that's why at COP26, if you followed that, we got nowhere on food stuff. Hannah, you have to block your ears at the moment. It was shameful that Britain, as chair of COP26, did nothing on food and sustainable consumption. Why? Because food and sustainable consumption account for 20 to 30% of all greenhouse gases, let alone the biggest driver of biodiversity, the biggest user of water, the biggest shaper and framer of land use, of the biggest expenditure that most people on the planet spend is food. So to be silent on that was a sign that the politicians didn't want to engage with the consumer. And that's why we argued, and Lise brilliantly put together this session, why we thought it was really important to engage with this fabulous movement of the Oxford Real Food and Farming Conference, is to say, look, even as Martin, you and your cohorts are talking about what can we do to make more progressive farming, we've got to engage with the single mother in a tower block who's got very little money and is struggling. Unless we engage with the mass of the British public to get consumer change, we're done for, frankly. The auguries, the science, the intergovernmental panel data on climate change data are very clear. The biodiversity data are very clear. Let me be very stark. I'm old, I will see the earth out, but my grandchildren won't, frankly, unless we get a grip of this. So it's multi-criteria analysis time, a multi-criteria labeling time for food or bust. I'm very stark. Fifthly, why now? Why in Britain, this rather odd post-imperial country, a declining power? You know, if you've read my Feeding Britain book, you'll know we couldn't defend food supply lines if we wanted to, actually. We've only got 17 patrol boats, rubber things, which can't even keep immigrants out. I'm not even entering in there, I'm not saying whether I think that's a good or bad thing. I actually think it's a bad thing. It's totally mismanaged, but we couldn't even protect our food supply lines. And the world, by the way, if you don't read papers, is in a rather tricky moment at the moment of geopolitics. And Britain is siding itself with some very tricky positioning at the moment. And I don't want to be scary about that. I work on food defense stuff. I'm very interested in that. I think we and people like this conference ought to be much more engaged in food defense, saying, how can we protect our food supply? Are the real people getting it who need it? And the answer is at the moment, no. So the UK really has an opportunity to listen to the other four speakers, and Fidelity is waiting patiently at the moment, and to work with Lise and across civil society to bring a more coherent position around this simple and rather ineffective policy measure called labeling. It's really important that we do that. We've got the food bill this year, unless it's pushed out, which is quite possible, by the way. There are lots of people in the cabinet who do not want the food bill, by the way. So if we're going to get it, it's only going to happen if there's coherence across us, not all of us saying, me, I want my issue. Forget yours, I want mine. It's all of them or bust, is my point. So civil society is really important. Dear Oxford Real Farming Conference, we are very important. I speak now not as an academic, but just as someone active all 45 years of my working life in civil society. This is a critical period for us to make life very positive for Hannah and her colleagues. Half of my students, ex-students, work in places like Defra around the world. We've got to help them, but be hard. Help them, but be hard. It cannot just be animal welfare, Hannah. You can't possibly answer. Unless it's multi-criteria labeling, we're done for. And so it's a test, I think. I see Anya nodding. I see you all nodding, actually. This is really critical to come together. And the idea behind OmniAction is to try to pull that together, because there are some progressive forces in business and there are some who aren't. And our job is to try and get unholy alliances together. This is unholy alliance time, dear friends. It's that or bust, in my view. Lise.
Thank you so much, Tim. That's plenty for us to be thinking about and considering. I'm going to go to Fidelity now to sort of open the Q&A. Fidelity, the thing that this has left me with, and it might be something actually for Anya and for Hannah to respond to as well, is to do with the fact that at ORFC, we all talk about agroecology and regenerative farming as though we know what that is and as though those are defined things. In fact, I don't think either of them actually are. And I think if we all started talking about what we thought it was, we'd find that we disagreed. And I strongly suspect that by creating frameworks, by working toward the kind of labeling that Colyer would like and that OmniAction would like, it will help us iterate towards something that Defra could perhaps in 5 years' time define as agroecology, regenerative farming. Anya, did you just put your hand up?
I didn't, but I'm happy to respond to you.
Fidelity, I don't know if you'd like to go first, and then we'll go to Anya and maybe Hannah about that as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Lise, and thanks to all of you amazing presenters. I think what we've heard today is a very powerful case for mandatory government-led labelling. We've also heard that it's a complicated business and there's lots of voluntary stuff going on at the moment. And I suppose I would just like to really get across the message that it might be complicated, but that is definitely not a reason for tackling it and working our way through this system. That I think there's so much going for us at the moment, at this very moment in time, to get a really good government-led mandatory labelling process in place. We've got the Environment Bill that's come in. The government says it wants to leave the environment in a better place in 25 years. We've got massive and exciting changes happening in farming. And Martin told us all about the amazing thing that he's doing on his farm to change from the way he was farming 20 years ago, very chemically based, to one now that's understanding the biological processes that need to be respected under the soil, in the hedgerows, on the fields, in the woods. There are farmers like Martin across the whole of the country who are making these changes. We happen to be one of them here. We want the public who want to buy food that we produce from us to be able to identify that in the marketplace. And at the moment, it's completely impossible how to do it. So our system, our case for the government is that this should be driven by actual data that's happening on real farms from the bottom up. And as you rightly say, Lisa, you could then say in 5 years' time, you can see exactly what the outcomes are of these various processes. We as farmers, I mean, we're signed up with the Soil Association here at home. We're already being asked to produce loads of information about our animal welfare, about what we're putting on our crops, how we're growing our grass. It's not difficult to be presenting information in a way that then just goes onto a centrally held matrix. Anya has shown us how it's possible, that the data systems are now there for that to happen. So I feel that we're at a real crossroads, and if we don't seize this opportunity now, in fact, in this coming year, because it's the year that the government are consulting on labelling, and take this incredibly wide, holistic approach, driven from the bottom up, then I feel we'll miss the opportunity if we don't really get that going this year. And I think just coming back to the point that Tim was making, and Hannah acknowledged that they've picked on animal welfare as a starting point. That's fair enough, but I think we have to be really careful and make sure that by taking a slightly siloed introduction to all of this, we're not missing the bigger picture, not asking the right questions to make sure that we have a very simple system that means that we're covering everything: environment, animal welfare, biodiversity. You could start bringing in things like social aspects, whether people are paying their workers a decent wage. That would particularly apply to goods that are coming in from abroad. It should definitely apply to all points of sale for all food. So I think that we have to just get going and start on this. And as you rightly say, we might then come to a better understanding about what is going into some of these really important terms. Having said that, one last point, Lisa, because I'm not here to make a lecture, just to answer a few questions. We've presented a roadmap to the government that we believe they could start working on some of the first things to improve things, and one would actually be looking at those definitions. I noticed in the chat there's lots of talk about, is the quality of life of a free-range chicken really free range? That's a very interesting question, and those sorts of issues can be looked at. So yeah, thanks everyone for your contribution, and hopefully there'll be a great discussion now with the panel, and there are lots of questions and answers which we need to respond to.
Turn to. Shall we quickly just see if Anya and Hannah wanted to respond on that point, though, about the fact that although we all think we know what these terms mean, in fact, I'm not convinced that we do.
Yeah, so I mean, I've seen a few comments in the chat just about, personally, whether we just focus on carbon footprint, and this acknowledgement that there are lots of other metrics to look at. And I think my point is very much in line with Tim's, which is that I don't think we can afford by any means to just pick kind of one of these things and say this is the most important one and overlook the others. And having said that, there will be people who are experts and specialists within one of those particular things. Myself, for example, I focus on carbon and environment. There are, plenty of people who have kind of decades of experience looking at the social aspect, animal welfare aspect, etc. And for me, things like OmniAction and also what Defra are doing are really about bringing those together into a cohesive framework and picking up on the best of kind of what everyone has to offer across that system. I think to your point and questions about things like regenerative agriculture, agroecology, etc. I think we should kind of get away from the idea of looking at all of these metrics as fixed things in time, as if we kind of know exactly what the carbon footprint or exactly what regenerative farming means. These are things which are evolving all the time, and they've changed very much in the last kind of 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. They will continue to change, and for me, again, that really just drives home the point that we need to have a framework and a system where these things can be updated in line with the best research, etc. And we're not just saying, right, 2023, we're going to define exactly what this metric looks like, and it's never going to change going forward. But it's about, kind of having that framework and system set up to track things over time.
Great, thank you so much. And I think that's a point really worth underlining, actually, which is that there is a sort of philosophical or ideological problem that we've suffered from, which is where, scientists with the best will in the world have spent a lot of time trying to achieve the perfect matrix, the perfect set of metrics and the perfect approach to analysis, while in the meantime, nothing gets done. So I think that one of the key things that Colyer is talking about here, certainly Anya, Tim, OmniAction, we are quite obsessed with being very, very honest with all parties, including customers, that this is where we are at the moment in terms of the knowledge base, in terms of the standards, that we're going to create a definition that is practical and can be worked with, and that will continue to iterate, because frankly, that's real life. Nothing stays the same. We all know the way technology works. It's all about being agile. It's all about being iterative. And but nowhere in the world of labeling are we seeing that honesty being expressed yet. Fidelity, you look like you want to say something.
I'm just typing a reply to somebody.
Okay.
I'm going through some of the questions.
Great.
So,
Hannah, sorry, we haven't given you the chance to respond yet on any of this.
I'm sure my response will probably be a bit unsatisfactory, but so some of you might have seen, I know certainly Tim has, the food security report came out recently, and some of the information in that included things on consumer confidence in labelling, for example. And from our point of view, and from that report, consumers do largely have confidence in the food information that they have on packet. That's what's in the report. I know personally, I get contacted an awful lot about terminology. Grass-fed, we mentioned when I spoke earlier, a whole plethora of other terms. Regenerative agriculture, which has actually been around for 10, 20, 30, 40, however many years. Your grandfather, great-grandfather did it, and it's changed its name and evolved as we've gone through. Those terms are really important to people, so I can't deny I do get contacted about them. The department does get contacted about them. But the report that we had out recently does say that, generally speaking, consumers do have confidence. So it's making sure that we're tackling the right terms and doing what's the priority, I think, from our perspective.
Okay, Martin, I should allow you to come in here. I'm quite surprised to hear that Defra believes that consumers do have confidence in these terms. Sorry, Hannah.
It's the finding in the food security report. It's a statistical analysis of the data that's out there. It's not a policy document. It's not our position per se, but that is what was found in the report when they did the statistical analysis. As I said, we get written to about terminology an awful lot. I've certainly had discussions with Fidelity and others, not just about grass-fed terminology, but a wide range of terms. So it is something that's on our radar, but that's what the finding in the food security report was.
Thank you.
It would be really interesting to find out what the questions were to get those responses. I think public do trust farmers and some of the labelling systems, but they don't understand or know and trust some of it, and it's that balance. What really concerns me is there's language around leaving the industry to do that. Let the supermarkets improve their labelling and do that. Quite frankly, we know that just end up in a poor, that'll only benefit those supermarkets for their profitability. It will not change the delivery on the ground and the profitability for the farmer and the health quality of that food and bits and pieces. So it really worries me that we are delaying this action and this transition and actually clearly defining some bits around labelling. There is so much we've heard that needs pulling into this, but we must start. We have a climate and biodiversity emergency. We have a few years left to get this action starting to happen. The action farmers will take on the ground when Elm comes in 25 will take 3 or 4 years to deliver. So by 2030, we might see stuff actually happening. We need action now. And that's really where I get concerned that we talk of reports and stuff that we'll think of stuff that will come out in a year or two in a report. So what's the government and Defra putting around their clear framework of this is the things we want? We want to hear it loud and clear that this is the farming system. These are our food production standards while we put that labelling system in place.
Yeah, great, thanks. I can see that we've got a question from Tom Scrope, actually, which touches on this. And the question is, what information do farmers need to provide to be able to prove that they are farming in a nature-friendly way? And as you say, to avoid the greenwash, is it soil data? You know, what would you say, Martin? And then perhaps we'll ask Fidelity as well.
Where are they and where they're moving to? This is about a journey. We can't say this is the perfect standard and this is where everyone's got to be. It's about moving along a line. So are you improving water, soil, biodiversity? Is your food quality? Are you reducing your pesticide load to your landscape, harming your thing? So what are you measuring? And it's about moving that along and sort of understanding where we're all in different places as farmers. And it's about taking the steps and recognizing actually farming with nature and improving nature and the landscape actually makes your farming a more profitable farming system. And it takes the pressure from the landscape and actually delivers us healthier food. So it's about that journey and putting those matrix in places.
Brilliant, thanks. We've got another question from Beatrix Oliver, who's asking what the practicalities of labelling imported products is and whether it's really feasible. I know, Anya, you sort of touched on that, but it's a very important point, isn't it?
Yeah, this is a really interesting point, and I think one which was, people touched on in this talk. from our experience, it does get infinitely more complicated when you try and label imported products. Just as an example, we were working last year with a coffee company, and they actually know exactly which farms their coffee comes from in Peru, and we wanted to find out a bit more about the practices that were going on in those farms. They visit the farm, once every 6 months, but unfortunately the people on farm aren't literate, and obviously we have English, they're speaking a different language, etc. So it wasn't really practical to gather the information in the same way that you might be able to do in the UK. So that's just kind of one example of an imported product that's already kind of UK manufactured, and I think it gets more challenging as you might not even be working with a UK company. But I do think with all of these things, I really love what Fidelity said, which is that we can't let these kind of stumbling blocks be the way that we just keep kicking the can down the road, because there are things that we can do, which is saying, okay, potentially for imported products we might not be using as much primary data, but actually, as I showed on my slides, you can still use other methods like secondary data, which can give people a good idea of what the difference between product types are. And again, this is just where we need to have a clear kind of policy and framework, which is saying if we can't have this data, then you should use this approach instead. And I'm hoping that through things like OmniAction, we can start to answer questions like that, and then create a system that is transparent and actually makes sense for what we have.
Brilliant, thank you. Fidelity, you've got your hand up.
Yes, thanks, Lisa. I just wanted to partly follow up on Martin's question, Martin's answer about the question of just getting on with it, and that we haven't got time. I think one of the things that is concerning at the moment is still hearing messages from Defra that they sort of like the idea of a voluntary system. They like the idea of supermarkets driving this, because in a way, the more and more we see new labels coming out of supermarkets competing against each other, trying to show that their products are best, the more confusing it actually becomes for the consumer, because it smacks of greenwash the whole time. And I think the only way we're going to resolve this is to have a mandatory system that really is led by the government from the bottom up. And just to sort of put a bit more a bit more of an example on what Martin was saying about what the sorts of information we can be collecting. I mean, we're in a time of huge flux at the moment, but for instance, there's some very easy collection that could already start taking place that could work towards a label. For instance, if farmers are doing things under the new sustainable farming incentive, that should be a big tick for them, that nobody's asking anyone to collect any more data on that. If you're complying with some ELMS things, that's doing it. If you're a whole farm system like your certified organic or with LEAF or with any of those systems, again, they should be recognized that they're doing great things for the environment, animal welfare, and they pop you onto the matrix. So there's a lot of stuff that could already start being put in there to go up to a label. I personally think that we are going to be increasingly be asked to just provide information, for instance, on maybe the miles of hedgerows that we've got on our farms compared to land, whether they're big, thick, fat hedgerows or very well cut hedgerows. And this is data that we're going to increasingly be asked to collect and to record in some way. It's incredibly simple now to record things like that on databases, and all of that should be quite easily fed in. So you're really driving your labeling from the bottom up on what is actually happening on the ground. And it's really interesting seeing what Anya was saying about secondary information and primary information. I really like that distinction because, as she rightly said in her slides, the ultimate data we want is primary data, and we will get better at it. We will find new points of which we can easily collect data, and they can all be fed into this Omni label, which again, I like the current design of that Omni label, which has got it's got an icon for environment. I can't remember what they exactly were, but there's one for possibly animal welfare, maybe a carbon, maybe food miles, maybe packaging. You could put a whole heap of icons on it. And we do know that labeling makes a difference. So the nutritional labeling that's come in the UK has influenced people's purchases of food and stuff. So the 5% that Anya was talking about, I'm quite sure will get bigger over time. And as Lise, you really rightly said, the main thing is these labels create discussions and they start connecting people up. And people are really interested in knowing how their food's produced. We do open days here a lot at our farm. And I'm absolutely amazed at how people from across the board want to come. Open Farm Sundays being the most brilliant thing for a lot of us farmers. We might get thousands of people coming along on one day, and they really want to understand more about how their food's produced. And a label is, I know it's the lowest common denominator, but I do think it can be a driver for absolute change, and we have to go for it.
Brilliant, thank you so much. We've got a question here from Ginny, or it's actually a point really, about the fact that current environmental accounting promotes intensification and it increases in yield to generate improvements. And I think the point that we're making here is that with better data collection and with a better reflection of that data collection across labeling, we can nudge the market away from that attitude. So we could talk all day about this subject. I think I'm going to ask Tim Lang to come in again in a second, actually, just to close us out. But I just want to make sure, Fidelity, have you put the web address for Clear into the chat or the Q&A so that people can sign the petition and can, you know, carry on this very, very important conversation and carry on being engaged. And I hope nobody minds me mentioning the fact that OmniAction, which we've just launched, we're having our launch event on January the 27th. If you go to omniaction.org, you will see all the information there. And that's where, as Fidelity mentioned, we're looking at pulling together all relevant metrics in terms of impacts created by the food system, and that's across environmental impact as well as labour rights, land tenure, nutrition and food safety. So that's what we've been talking about, and if anybody would like to, you know, to pick up and come along and have a look, that would be, you know, wonderful. Everybody is welcome. OmniAction is it's a global non-profit. So we're looking at this not just from the UK perspective, but from the global perspective. Having said that, we are very much encouraged by the fact that we will have hero states involved, and we would really hope that England and Wales will be one of these hero states along with the EU. But
Lise,
yes.
Lise, sorry to interrupt, it's Craig here, but if we can't try and finish 12:30 sharp, it's going to be a problem starting the next one if we don't end then.
Okay, so if nobody minds, I'm going to let Tim have the final word. We've just got 2 minutes left.
I'll do it in 30 seconds, so it goes
Go
back.
on.
Basically, look, this is great. This is a really important and good conversation to be having. But I stress again what we've all said, and indeed it's been lovely across all of the speakers, indeed across all of the Q&As. Everyone agrees something needs to be done. Let me be very stark and political with a capital P. I'm not talking from any party politics point, but this, unless we get our MPs to engage with this, nothing will happen. Unless we get people we know in the House of Lords to engage on when the white paper goes through as a food bill, nothing will happen. Scotland, Wales, Ireland, not just Northern Ireland, Ireland and England must work in harmony. There's some really tricky politics in this. Let me be very clear, that's my job. Unless we keep this aligned and working alongside the farm to fork process in the European Union, and no one talks about that in Britain yet, they're way ahead of us now. We've been faffing around for 5 years over Brexit and failing to deliver it, by the way, as an ex-Tory Secretary of State said to me the other day. It's not being delivered. Unless we engage with Europe, we're just going to be utterly marginal and find ourselves not shaping things. Now, the great thing that Britain has, and is really good on this session, is we have fabulous civil society, thinking, reasonably well funded. I know we're all poor, you're poor, I'm a well-paid professor, but you're all absolutely poverty-stricken NGOs, etc., etc. I'm joking. We've got to actually use our civil society leverage. It's very, very important. So great stuff. I would like to just thank Lise and the OmniAction people for putting this on. It's a great privilege to work with them and to just say, God, as I always say to my students, work harder.
Well, thank you so much. And on that note, we'll close out. Thank you so much to Colyer, in fact, and thank you to Fidelity. Thank you to Martin. Thank you so much to Anya, and thank you to Tim, and thank you to our audience. And please do keep the conversation going. Get involved with Colyer. I think we've made the website known to everybody. And to continue the conversation, again, please do join us on the 27th, omniaction.org. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you all.